November 27th, 1950. 2 in the morning. The temperature at the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea has dropped to 36 degrees below zero. Not 36 below Celsius. 36 below Fahrenheit. Cold enough that the morphine in a medic's kit freezes solid before he can inject it. Cold enough that the grease inside a rifle bolt turns to gel, and the weapon won't fire. Cold enough that a man who sits down for 10 minutes and closes his eyes doesn't open them again. 30,000 American soldiers and Marines are camped in the mountains around that frozen reservoir. They came north because General Douglas MacArthur told Washington the war would be over by Christmas. They are about to find out how wrong he was. At 2 in the morning on November 27th, the bugles started. Chinese bugles, from every direction. 120,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army came out of the dark and hit the American lines from 4 sides at once. 4 to 1, in the dark, in the ice. The men on those hills had no idea how many Chinese were out there. They had no idea that the Chinese 9th Army Group had marched 200 miles through that same mountain wilderness in total secrecy. No vehicles, no fires, no radio traffic, and had been waiting in those hills for days. They had no idea that Mao Zedong himself had issued the order, destroy the 1st Marine Division. But one man knew. He had known for weeks, and while every general above him was looking the other way, he had been quietly, carefully, building the thing that would save them. His name was Oliver Prince Smith. He was 57 years old, rail-thin, white-haired. His Marines called him the Professor, not because he looked dangerous, because he didn't. He looked like someone who taught high school chemistry and coached the debate team on weekends. He was soft-spoken. He was polite. He read philosophy books the night before combat operations. And he was the only general in that entire theater of war who understood what was coming and had done something about it. This is his story. The relationship between Oliver Smith and his commanding general started badly and got worse from there. General Edward Almond commanded the Army's X Corps, the force that Smith's Marines were assigned to. The two men met for the first time in Japan during the planning sessions for the Incheon landing, the September 1950 amphibious assault that cracked the Korean War wide open. Almond had never planned an amphibious operation. He had never been part of one. Smith had spent 30 years studying amphibious warfare. He had led Marines onto the beaches at Cape Gloucester, at Peleliu, at Okinawa. Almond spent that first meeting telling Smith things Smith already knew about a subject Almond had never practiced. Then, at some point, Almond looked at the man sitting across from him, the man who was only 10 months younger than he was, and called him son. Smith said later, in his own words, "I tried to tell him a few of the facts of life, and he was rather supercilious, and he called me son, which kind of annoyed me." That was how it began. It never got better. Almond was what other officers called a MacArthur man. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of all UN forces in Korea, ran his war from the Daiichi building in Tokyo, a former insurance company headquarters that MacArthur had converted into his command palace. He rarely visited the front. He held briefings in comfort. He issued orders with certainty. Almond operated on the assumption that whatever MacArthur believed was correct, and that any officer who questioned it was simply not thinking clearly. Smith said of Almond years later, "MacArthur was God to him. Whatever MacArthur said, nothing could change it." By October 1950, the war seemed to be going exactly as MacArthur predicted. The Incheon landing had succeeded. Seoul had been recaptured. The North Korean army was broken and running. MacArthur announced that the boys would be home by Christmas. X Corps, Almond's command, received orders to push north toward the Chinese border, to the Yalu River. The plan was to divide the UN forces. The 8th Army would advance up the western side of the peninsula, X-Corps, Smith's Marines, and 2 Army divisions would push up the eastern side. Between them, mountains. No roads connecting the 2 commands. No way for one to support the other. Ullman spread his 5 divisions across a front 400 miles wide. Oliver Smith looked at the map. He looked at the single road that wound 60 miles up from the coast, through Funchalen Pass, through Kotori, through Hagaruri, all the way up to the frozen reservoir sitting at 4,000 feet above sea level in the mountains of North Korea. One road, one way in, one way out. He wrote a letter, not an official report, not a memorandum through channels, a personal letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps back in Washington. He put his concerns on the record in his own handwriting. Our left flank is wide open. I have little confidence in the tactical judgment of X-Corps or in the realism of their planning. Then he went to Ullman's headquarters and said the same thing out loud. He told Ullman the plan was rash. He said the divisions were too spread out. He said advancing up a single mountain road in winter, without flank protection, against an enemy whose strength was unknown, was an invitation to catastrophe. Ullman listened. Then he told Smith to move faster. When Ullman left Smith's headquarters that day, Smith waited until the sound of the jeep had faded. Then he turned to his staff and said, "We're not going anywhere until I get this division together and the airfield built." His staff looked at him. Ullman had not ordered any airfield. Ullman had not mentioned any airfield. Ullman wanted them moving north, fast all the way to the Yalu before Christmas. But Oliver Smith had already decided. He had seen this before. On Peleliu, in 1944, the commanding general had promised the battle would last 4 days. It lasted more than 2 months. Smith had sat on the ship the night before, that landing reading a biography of Oliver Wendell Holmes, waiting for a battle he already knew was going to be worse than anyone above him admitted. He was not going to let that happen again. Not here. Not to these men. He picked up the phone and called his engineers. He told them to start building a supply depot at Hagaruri, the small village at the southern tip of the reservoir where the single road forked. He told them to stockpile ammunition, food, medical supplies, enough to sustain the division if it got cut off. Then he told them to start building an airstrip. The engineers started laying it out on the frozen ground. It was November 19th. A few days later, Ullman made a visit to Smith's forward command post. He looked around at the pace of the advance. He looked at the map. He told Smith and his staff, "We've got to go barreling up that road." Smith said nothing. Ullman left. The engineers kept digging. At this point, Smith was advancing his division at an average of about 1 mile per day. Ullman wanted him moving 20 times that fast. Word came down from X-Corps headquarters that Smith was being dangerously slow, dangerously cautious, not in the spirit of the offensive. He did not change course. Every mile north he was placing another supply cache along the road. Every mile north he was keeping his regiments within supporting distance of each other, so that if one got hit, the others could reach it. And back at Hagaruri, his engineers were scraping an airstrip out of the frozen earth. When Smith first raised the idea with Ullman, asking for X-Corps engineers to help build it, Ullman's response, as Smith would later recount, was 3 words. What casualties? As in, why would there be casualties? We're advancing. Smith went back to his own engineers and told them to keep digging. He did not have authorization for the airstrip. He did not have approval. He had a map, and he had experience, and he had 30 years of watching what happens when a military plan assumes that everything is going to go exactly right. His Marines called him the Professor because he was quiet and bookish. But there was something else behind that quiet. A man who had looked at every piece of intelligence coming back from the hills. Reports of Chinese soldiers captured, Korean civilians vanishing from villages, deer moving down from the ridgelines as though something above them had disturbed the mountains, and had reached a conclusion that no one above him was willing to reach. The Chinese were already there. They were waiting. And when they moved, a Marine division strung out along 60 miles of mountain road was going to need an airstrip to get its wounded out. By November 27th, the WWII airstrip was still not finished. The engineers were still working when the sun went down that evening. Still working when the temperature dropped past 30 below. Still working at 2 in the morning when the Chinese bugles started. To understand what Oliver Smith was up against, you have to understand what the rest of the world believed in November of 1950. The Korean War had started in June. North Korea invaded South Korea. The American-led UN force was nearly pushed into the sea. Then came Incheon. MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon in September was one of the most audacious operations in the history of the American military. The tides at Incheon were among the most dangerous on Earth. The harbor was mined. The approach was exposed. Every expert who looked at the plan said it couldn't work. MacArthur said it would. It did. Seoul was retaken. The North Korean army collapsed. What had looked like certain defeat turned into a rout. MacArthur's reputation, already enormous, became something close to invincible. He was 70 years old. He had been in uniform for half a century. He had commanded armies in 2 world wars. He was the most decorated American soldier alive. And he was certain, absolutely, completely certain, that he understood this war, understood this enemy, understood this moment. He announced his plan: drive north to the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. Destroy whatever remained of the North Korean army. End the war. Home by Christmas. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington had doubts. The Truman administration had doubts. China had already sent warnings that it would enter the war if UN forces approached its border. MacArthur dismissed the warnings. He dismissed the doubts. He was MacArthur. And for a few weeks in October 1950, it seemed like he might be right again. UN forces poured across the 38th parallel. They moved north fast. The North Korean resistance was crumbling. Then, in late October, the first reports came in. South Korean units near the Chinese border had made contact with soldiers who were not North Korean. They were Chinese. The reports went up the chain of command. They reached X-Corps. They reached MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. The official response: these were volunteers. A small number of Chinese irregulars. Nothing to be alarmed about. MacArthur continued north. Oliver Smith did not believe it. He had intelligence reports that his own division's patrols were generating, not the cleaned-up summaries that traveled up through channels to Tokyo, but the raw accounts from the men who had actually been out in those hills. Chinese soldiers were being captured, not a handful. Enough that Smith's intelligence officers were building a picture of entire formations, regiments, divisions, moving through the mountains at night, hiding by day, leaving almost no trace. The historian David Halberstam, who spent years reconstructing the Korean War, wrote that Smith was operating with a fundamentally different understanding of reality than the commanders above him. MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo believed what it wanted to believe. Smith believed what his patrols told him. There was something else Smith understood that the planners in Tokyo seemed to have missed. Look at the map again. MacArthur's offensive had 2 separate prongs. The 8th Army in the west, X-Corps in the east. Between those 2 forces, the Taebaek Mountains, running north to south like a spine down the center of the peninsula. No roads crossed it. No lateral communication was possible. If one force got hit, the other could not come to its aid. By mid-November, Ulman's 5 divisions were spread across a front 400 miles wide. In military doctrine, a force spread that thin, across terrain that hostile, in weather that severe, is not a battle formation. It is a series of targets. Smith wrote in his personal diary that he felt X-Corps was advancing with no flank protection and no contact with adjacent units, into terrain that could swallow entire divisions without anyone knowing they were gone until it was too late. He was not the only officer who had doubts, but he was one of the very few willing to act on them. Most senior American commanders in Korea at that point were doing one of two things. Some were going along with MacArthur's plan, telling themselves he had been right before and would be right again. Others had private reservations but kept them private because questioning MacArthur wasn't something that advanced a career. Smith did neither. He put his doubts in writing, the personal letter to the commandant, the explicit statement that he had no confidence in ex-corps planning. And then, every single day, he acted on those doubts in ways that Almond could see but couldn't quite order him to stop. The slow march, the supply depots, the airstrip going up at Hagaruri. Each decision was individually defensible. A division commander consolidating his regiments before pushing further north. A general securing his supply lines. An officer requesting an airfield to support future operations. None of it was technically insubordinate. All of it was exactly what Almond did not want him doing. There is one detail from these weeks that military historians have returned to again and again because it says something essential about the difference between these two men. When Smith requested ex-corps engineers to help build the Hagaruri airstrip, the request was denied. Ex-corps was not interested in airfields in that area. So Smith called his own engineers, Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge and the 1st Engineer Battalion, and told them to build it themselves. They worked in rotating shifts, day and night, in temperatures that dropped past 30 below. The frozen earth was as hard as concrete. They used explosives to break the surface. They scraped and graded and compacted a runway long enough for transport aircraft, 4,000 feet above sea level, with equipment not designed for these conditions, in weather that was killing men who simply stopped moving. They started November 19th. The battle began on November 27th. On December 1st, 12 days in, the first C-47 transport plane landed on that strip. In the 5 days that followed, before Smith's division fought its way south and the airstrip was abandoned, 4,312 wounded and frost-bitten men were flown off that field. 4,312. Almond, years later, claimed credit for the airstrip. In his official oral history, he said he had essentially directed Smith to build it. Smith's own letters to his wife, written weeks before the battle, before the Chinese attacked, before any of it began, show he had been planning the airstrip entirely on his own. When he asked ex-corps for engineering support, the answer was no. When the airstrip saved thousands of lives, Almond said it had been his idea. Oliver Smith never responded publicly. He didn't argue. He didn't correct the record in any official forum. He was already in the middle of the battle the airstrip had been built for. He didn't have time to fight a war over who deserved the credit. He was too busy trying to get his men home. The Chinese did not attack all at once. They came in waves. The first wave hit the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments at the northwest end of the reservoir, near a village called WWII. 2 Chinese divisions, roughly 20,000 men, came out of the hills and drove straight into the Marine lines. A 3rd Chinese division swept in behind them, cutting the road between WWII and Hagaruri, trying to sever the Marines from their own base. At the same time, on the eastern shore of the reservoir, the Army's Task Force Faith, 2 infantry battalions of the 7th Infantry Division, roughly 2,300 soldiers, was hit by 2 more Chinese divisions. Hit hard. On the south side of the reservoir, at Fox Company's position on a hill guarding Toktong Pass, the only road connecting WWII to Hagaruri, a single reinforced rifle company of about 220 Marines was surrounded and attacked, outnumbered many times over, through 5 straight days and nights. They held, but no one knew for how long. In the middle of all of this, at Hagaruri, Oliver Smith sat in his command post with a radio. He was the only senior commander at the key position on the map, the junction where all the roads met, the place where the airstrip was still being scraped out of the ice, the point that had to hold or nothing else would matter. He had flown there himself that morning before the attack, because he had calculated, looking at the geography, looking at what he knew about Chinese doctrine, looking at the shape of the Y-formed road network, that WWII was where the battle would be decided, not at Udamni, where most of his combat strength was. Here, at the junction, at the airstrip. He was right. The same night, the Chinese 58th Division attacked WWII directly, trying to overrun the command post, the supply depot, and the airstrip. Smith had fewer than 1,000 combat-effective troops defending the perimeter. The Chinese got through in places. They took East Hill, the high ground above the village. For a period of hours, Chinese soldiers controlled a position from which they could fire directly into the Marine command post. Smith did not leave. He stayed at the radio. He was listening to reports coming in from 4 different surrounded positions at once: Udamni, Fox Hill, the army units on the east shore, and now his own perimeter at WWII. And General Almond was silent. Smith had been trying to reach X-Corps headquarters since the attacks began. For nearly 2 days, he could not get a clear answer on what he was authorized to do. He could not order a general withdrawal without permission from above. He could not order his regiments at Udamni to start moving south without formal orders to do so. The chain of command had stopped working at the exact moment it was needed most. So Smith did what he could do within the authority he had. He ordered the 5th and 7th Marines at Udamni to abandon their offensive objectives, the westward attack Almond had ordered, and to consolidate their positions, defend, hold, wait for orders. He ordered Fox Company on Toktong Pass to hold at all costs. He ordered his engineers at WWII to pick up rifles and defend the airstrip. The engineers put down their scrapers and picked up weapons. They held the airstrip through the night. It was not until late on November 28th, nearly 2 full days after the attack began, that Smith finally received orders from X-Corps. The order was to retreat. But the order also came with a condition that Smith found almost incomprehensible. Almond directed Smith to destroy his division's equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles, before withdrawing. Leave it all behind. Get out as fast as possible. Smith's response was immediate. He later described it this way: "We are going to fight our way out. We need our equipment to fight with. I am not going to destroy anything." Almond, faced with Smith's refusal, backed down. The equipment stayed, which meant something important. The Marines would not be a retreating mob. They would be a fighting division, intact, with its weapons moving south as a unit. That distinction, between a rout and a fighting withdrawal, would matter enormously in the days ahead. But first, the Marines at Udamni had to get back. 14 miles of mountain road in 30 below temperatures, with Chinese soldiers dug into every ridge and hilltop along the route, blocking the road, waiting in ambush. 14 miles. It would take almost 3 days. Lieutenant Colonel Ray Davis led his battalion on a night march through the open mountains, off the road entirely, moving cross-country through the snow in complete darkness, to relieve Fox Company on Toktong Pass before they were overrun. Davis would receive the Medal of Honor for that march. Fox Company's commander, Captain William Barber, would also receive the Medal of Honor for holding that hill for 5 days and nights against repeated attacks, with his company losing 1/3 of its strength, never giving up the pass that the Marines coming south would need. When the column from Udamni finally reached WWII on December 3rd, they came in on foot, carrying their weapons and their dead. Some had been walking for almost 4 days. They came in through the perimeter gate in good order, heads up, rifles in hand. Smith was there to meet them. He watched them come through. He said later, in one of the few emotional statements he ever made about Chosin, that he wanted the American people to understand how his Marines had come out of those mountains. Not broken, not scattered, in order. With heads up, he said. That was what he had built, not just the airstrip, not just the supply depots, not just the careful march north that had kept his regiments within reach of each other. He had built a division that could absorb a catastrophe and still come out fighting. It was December 4th. The battle was not over. There were still 60 miles of road between WWII and the sea, but the worst was behind them. Because of decisions made weeks earlier by a soft-spoken general with white hair who read philosophy books and moved at 1 mile per day, while everyone above him was barreling toward Christmas. A reporter asked Oliver Smith about the retreat. This was December 4th at WWII, while the Marines from WWII were still filing through the perimeter gate. The reporter used the word retreat. Smith looked at him. Retreat. Hell, he said. We're just attacking in another direction. The quote went out on the wire services and ran in newspapers across America. It is the most famous line from the Korean War. Most people who know it don't know the name of the man who said it. But what Smith meant by it was not bravado. It was a precise description of what his division was going to do for the next 7 days. They were not going to run south. They were going to fight south. Every mile of that road had Chinese soldiers on it. Every ridgeline had a blocking position. Every narrow pass was a potential ambush. The 60 miles between WWII and the coast did not become safe just because Smith's men were moving through it. It had to be cleared, mile by mile, hill by hill. Smith organized the breakout the same way he had organized everything else, methodically, in sequence, with each piece of the division protecting the next. The 7th Marines led the column south from WWII on December 6th. They fought through Kotori. They fought through Funchalen Pass, and then they reached the bridge. The bridge at Funchalen Pass crossed a gorge that dropped hundreds of feet into a reservoir below. The road went through it. There was no other way south. The Chinese had blown a section of it out. Without that bridge, Smith's tanks could not cross. His artillery could not cross. His trucks carrying the wounded could not cross. The division would have to abandon everything and go over the mountains on foot. Smith's engineer, Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge, the same man who had built the airstrip at WWII, had identified this bridge weeks earlier as the single most vulnerable point on the entire route. Before the battle, Partridge had worked out a plan. He requested that military treadway bridge sections, the kind that could span the gap, be parachute dropped into Kotori while the column was still assembling there. 8 sections were dropped. 1 fell into Chinese-held territory. 1 was damaged on impact. 6 sections were recovered by the engineers. 6 sections. It was exactly enough. On December 9th, working in the dark, in temperatures that had dropped to 20 below, the engineers laid the replacement bridge across the blown-out span. The column crossed, tanks first, then artillery, then the trucks carrying 600 wounded men who could not walk, and then, at the rear of the column, the dead. Smith had made a promise. He would bring out as many of his dead as possible. He kept it. On December 11th, the first elements of the 1st Marine Division walked into the port of Hungnam. The reservoir was 40 miles behind them and 4,000 feet above. 17 days of continuous combat. Surrounded at 4-1. No room for a single mistake. They brought out their equipment. They brought out their wounded. They brought out their dead. And they had done something else. Something the Chinese commanders had not anticipated and could not explain. The 8 Chinese divisions sent to destroy the 1st Marine Division had themselves been wrecked. Casualties estimated between 30,000 and 60,000 men, killed and wounded. 2 of those 8 divisions were so badly damaged they were disbanded. The force that had been ordered to annihilate Smith's Marines never recovered. Not because the Marines were lucky, Because one general had spent 3 weeks building something that could not be destroyed. One supply cache at a time, 1 mile per day, one airstrip scraped from frozen ground that no one above him had ordered, that no one above him had believed necessary, that no one above him would later admit had been his idea alone. On December 24th, 1950, the last ships left Hungnam Harbor. Oliver Smith was on one of them. The Korean War ended in July 1953. It would be 56 years before the first full biography of Oliver P. Smith was published. 56 years. The book was written by his granddaughter, Gail Scheisler. It came out in 2009. She called it For Country and Corps. It drew on family papers, personal letters, and oral histories that had never been available to outside researchers. Before that book, the most complete record of what Smith had done at Chosin lived in boxes at the Marine Corps archives that most historians had never opened. Why did it take so long? Part of the answer is MacArthur. When Truman fired MacArthur in April 1951, the story of the Korean War became largely the story of MacArthur's dismissal, his return home, his address to Congress, the controversy, the hearings. MacArthur consumed the narrative. Everyone else got smaller as he got larger. Part of the answer is Almond. Almond retired and spent years managing his own legacy. He gave oral histories. He corresponded with official historians. He claimed credit for the airstrip. Smith did none of that. He went to Camp Pendleton. He did his job. He did not write a memoir. He did not seek interviews. He did not campaign for recognition. He held his final assignment, Commanding General, Fleet Marine Force Atlantic, and retired in September 1955 after 38 years of service. He was advanced to 4-star general upon retirement, in formal recognition of his heroism in combat. He went home to Los Altos, California. He lived quietly. He died on December 25, 1977. Christmas Day. He was 84 years old. And the largest part of the answer, the part that explains why a man who saved an entire division became so thoroughly unknown, is simply who Oliver Smith was. He was not a man who needed to be remembered. He was a man who needed his Marines to get home. They got home. That was enough for him. But there is something the documentary record shows when you go back and read it carefully. The letters, the diaries, the after-action reports, the oral histories Smith gave decades after the fact. Smith was right about everything. Right that the Chinese were there. Right that the plan was rash. Right that the flanks were open. Right that one mountain road in 30 below weather was not a safe line of advance. Right that an airstrip would be needed. Right that destroying the equipment would be a mistake. Right that the division could fight its way out if it was intact and organized and supplied. Every judgment he made, every precaution he took that Almond told him was unnecessary. He was right. The military historian T.R. Fehrenbach, in his study of the Korean War, wrote that Chosun showed something the American military prefers not to examine too closely. That the system sometimes produces men who are wiser than the system itself, and that when those men act on their wisdom quietly, without the approval of those above them, the results can be the difference between a division that survives and a division that does not. After the battle, Marine Colonel Victor Krulak sent a message back to Headquarters Marine Corps in Washington. He wrote that Smith's decisions in the weeks before the attack had been the critical factor in the division's survival. The slow march, the supply depots, the airstrip. Krulak called it keen foresight. 2 words. For 3 weeks of preparation, carried out against orders, against pressure, against the certainty of every general above him, that saved thousands of American lives. Keen foresight. Oliver Smith never used those words about himself. He never said publicly that he had been right and Almond had been wrong. He never wrote about what it felt like to sit at that radio in WWII, listening to his men fighting in the dark while the chain of command went silent for 2 days. He kept it private. All of it. Which means there are things we will never know. What it cost him. What he thought in those hours. Whether the quiet of retirement in California ever felt loud with things he didn't say. He didn't tell us. And that, maybe, is the most Oliver Smith thing of all. If you've stayed with this story to the end, there's a good chance you understand something about it that no history book quite captures. Because a lot of you watching this had fathers or grandfathers or uncles who went to Korea or to the Pacific before that, and came home and put the uniform away and didn't talk about it. Not because it didn't matter, because some things are too large to fit into words at the dinner table. If you had someone like that in your family, someone who served and came back quiet, leave his name in the comments. Just his name. And where he served, if you know. That's all. The men who came off those mountains with their heads up, they deserve to be remembered. And so do the ones in your family. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who ought to know it. There are people in your life who have never heard the name Oliver P. Smith. Now you can change that.
The morning of September 15th, 1944. A Japanese artillery lieutenant stood inside a cave on the island of Peleliu and looked out at the Pacific Ocean. What he saw made him reach for his diary. He wrote that the sight of the American fleet, hundreds of ships stretched to the horizon in every direction, made him so furious he could feel the blood pounding through his veins. He wrote it the way a man writes when he cannot find any other words. Then he closed the diary, picked up his weapon, and waited. He had been waiting 5 months for this morning. Not because he was afraid, because the colonel who commanded his island had spent those 5 months building something that had never existed before in the Pacific War. 500 caves, miles of tunnels, steel doors that could be slid shut faster than a naval shell could answer back. A system designed from the ground up to do one specific thing, to make the United States Marines pay the highest possible price for every inch of coral on that island. The Navy officer who directed the pre-invasion bombardment told his men afterward, "Everything over there is done. You'll walk right in." The lieutenant's diary was found after the battle. He did not survive to read what the Marines said about that prediction. Kunio Nakagawa was not, by the standards of the Imperial Japanese Army, a remarkable man. He was the third son of an elementary school principal from Kumamoto Prefecture on the island of Kyushu. He had wanted to be a journalist. He became a soldier instead, because in Japan in the early 1900s, the army was one of the few paths available to a young man without money or family connections. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in December of 1918, 30th in his class. Not first, not last. 30th. He spent the next 2 decades doing what capable, unremarkable officers do, showing up, doing the work, moving up the ranks one rung at a time. He fought in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, where his superiors noticed he had what one later described as a supreme eye for the land, the ability to look at a piece of terrain and immediately understand how it could be used, how it could be held, and how it could kill the men who tried to take it. In March of 1943, he was promoted to colonel and given command of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 14th Division. In April of 1944, his regiment was ordered to a small island in the Palau chain called Peleliu. Before he left Japan, Nakagawa told his wife, according to accounts passed down through his unit, that he would not be coming back. He was not being dramatic. He was being precise. What had happened at Tarawa and Saipan, the systematic destruction of 2 Japanese garrisons by United States Marines, had already filtered back through the Army's command structure by the time Nakagawa reached Peleliu. The Imperial Japanese Army had assembled a research team to study those defeats. Nakagawa had read their findings. What those reports described was something the Japanese military had not believed possible when the war began. At Tarawa, in November of 1943, the Japanese garrison, nearly 5,000 strong, had built one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific. 14 coastal defense guns, concrete bunkers, interconnected pillboxes that had been months in construction. The Japanese commander had reportedly told his superiors that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. A Japanese anti-tank officer who survived fighting near Guadalcanal and later wrote about his experience described in detail the moment his unit realized that the Americans were not stopping, not slowing, not pulling back to regroup the way military doctrine said they should. The Americans absorbed casualties at a rate that doctrine said would halt any advancing force, and did not halt. Whatever the training manuals had said about the limits of American will under fire, the men writing from those battlefields had concluded the manuals were wrong. At Saipan the following summer, 32,000 Japanese troops mounted the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. 4,000 men, some of them walking wounded from field hospitals, threw themselves at the American line on the night of July 6th. The Marines and Army soldiers held. They fired until the barrels were hot and kept firing. When 4,000 men were dead, the American line was still there. The translators who later worked through the diaries collected from those battles described the tone shifting across the war. In 42, Japanese soldiers wrote about the Americans with contempt. In 43, with puzzlement. By 44, those who had faced the Marines were writing with something that had no clean name in Japanese military vocabulary. Not fear, exactly. More like the recognition that the thing they were facing did not operate according to any set of rules they had been trained to understand. Nakagawa absorbed all of it. He did not write a memo analyzing his conclusions. He did not send a report to headquarters outlining a new theory. He walked up Umur Mountain, the coral ridge that ran down the center of Peleliu like a broken spine, and began counting caves. There were 500 of them, most barely developed, some little more than gaps in the limestone left over from decades of phosphate mining. The Palau Island chain had been a source of phosphate for Japanese industry before the war, and the men who had worked those mines knew every shaft and chamber in the rock. Nakagawa found those men, and he put them back to work. The first order Nakagawa issued when he took command of Peleliu's defenses was one that confused almost every officer under his command. No one was to fire from the beach. In every previous island battle of the Pacific War, the Japanese had met the Americans at the waterline. The theory was sound. Hit the landing force when it was most vulnerable, crammed into boats and wading through surf before it could organize and bring its firepower to bear. It was the doctrine the Japanese army had built its island defense strategy around. It had not worked at Guadalcanal. It had not worked at Tarawa. It had not worked at Saipan. Nakagawa understood why. The American naval bombardment that preceded every landing was simply too accurate and too overwhelming for any position on the beach to survive it. Whatever you put at the waterline, the guns would find it and destroy it. The beach was a killing ground for defenders, not attackers, because the attackers controlled the guns offshore. So the beach would be left with mines and obstacles, enough to slow the first waves, enough to channel the landing craft into predictable paths. But the men, the guns, the real defense, all of it would go underground. The 214th Naval Construction Battalion had arrived on the island months earlier. Most of its men had been miners and tunnel laborers in civilian life, men who understood how limestone fractured, where the natural weaknesses in the rock ran, how deep you could go before the cave floor became unstable. They did not need to be told how to dig. What Nakagawa gave them was a reason and a design. The existing phosphate mine shafts became the backbone of the system. From those shafts, new tunnels branched outward and connected to the natural limestone caves that honeycombed the Umur. Some chambers were enlarged to accommodate field hospitals with electric lighting powered by generators. Others were fitted with water cisterns and rice storage. The men who would eventually fight from those positions could move between firing points, resupply, treat their wounded, and rest, all without ever exposing themselves to American air or naval fire. The cave entrances were modified with sliding steel doors. The principle was simple and lethal. A gun crew would open the door, fire, and close the door again before the naval gunners offshore could locate the muzzle flash and answer back. The Americans would see the shell, mark the rough direction, and fire. By the time their shell arrived, the door was shut and the crew was back inside the rock. The loopholes, the firing slits cut into bunkers and cave walls, were constructed at angles. A direct shot from outside could not penetrate them. A Marine with a flamethrower would have to position himself at precisely the right angle to use it effectively, and every foot of that approach was covered by fire from another position. Many of the cave systems were built on 2 levels. The lower level served as shelter during bombardment. The upper level was the fighting position. When American guns opened up, the defenders moved down and waited. When the guns lifted, which they always did just before the infantry advanced, the men climbed back up. By the time the Marines were moving across open ground, the guns were already back in position behind the rock. There was one more factor Nakagawa had calculated that the Americans had not accounted for. During the battle, surface temperature on the open coral would exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The Marines would be fighting in full gear, carrying weapons and ammunition, across open ground with no shade. The Japanese, underground in the cave system, would be fighting 15 to 20 degrees cooler. They could rest, eat, and treat their wounded without the heat eating through them. Every minute a Marine spent above ground was a minute the island itself was doing part of Nakagawa's work. Nakagawa's written order to his troops was distributed to every unit on the island before the first American ship appeared on the horizon. Each man was expected to kill 10 Marines before he died. It was not a slogan, it was arithmetic. If each of the island's 11,000 defenders fulfilled the order, the mathematics came out at something over 100,000 American casualties, more than the entire landing force. The American estimate for the operation, based on aerial reconnaissance that could photograph surface features but could not see underground, was 4 days. Nakagawa made no changes to his preparations. Major General William Rupertus had been fighting the Japanese since August of 1942. He had been on Guadalcanal. He had commanded Marines at Cape Gloucester. He had watched the Pacific War evolve from the chaotic early days, when neither side fully understood what kind of fight they were in, through Tarawa and the Grinding Island campaigns that followed. He was not an inexperienced man. He was not a reckless man. On the eve of the Peleliu landing, he called his officers together and told them what to expect. "We're going to have some casualties," he said, "but let me assure you this is going to be a fast one. Rough, but fast. We'll be through in 3 days. It may only take 2. 6 war correspondents came ashore with the Marines on Peleliu. Only 6. The prediction of a short, decisive battle had convinced most of the press corps to skip it. There were larger stories elsewhere. MacArthur was returning to the Philippines. The Allies were driving through France. Peleliu was going to be a footnote. The intelligence failure that produced Rupertus's prediction was not a matter of incompetence. It was a systematic problem that had plagued American amphibious planning throughout the war. Aerial photography, the primary tool for assessing an island's defenses before a landing, can only see the surface. The analysts in Pearl Harbor who studied the Peleliu photographs were looking at the right island. They were looking at the wrong part of it. The Navy officer who commanded the pre-invasion bombardment, 3 days of sustained shelling that was among the most intensive in the Pacific War, reported that the island had been effectively neutralized. What the bombardment had actually accomplished was this: it had changed the island's scenery. The same Japanese artillery lieutenant who had written about the blood pounding in his veins at the sight of the American fleet added a second entry that same morning. Despite 3 days of shelling, exactly 1 man in his company had been wounded. He and his men had spent those 3 days in the lower level of their cave system, waiting. On the morning of September 15th, the first wave of Marines climbed into their landing craft and headed for the beach. At 8:32, they touched shore. 5 minutes of silence followed. The island was completely still. The men looked at one another. Then the steel doors opened. By nightfall on the first day, 1,100 Marines were dead or wounded. 60 tracked landing vehicles had been destroyed on the beach or in the water. The heat, 115 degrees on the open coral with no shade and no wind, had emptied every canteen within 2 hours of landing. The water brought up to resupply. The men had been stored in drums that had previously held oil. It tasted like petroleum. Men who drank it became sick. Men who did not drink it passed out from heat exhaustion. The Navy had said the island was done. Rupertus had said 3 days, maybe 2. Inside the caves, the Japanese lieutenant opened his diary again. He had been wrong about one thing that morning, he wrote. He had expected the Americans to falter at the beach. Every piece of training he had received, every report he had read about American soldiers in other theaters, had suggested that an enemy hit that hard at the waterline would pause, would pull back, would need time to reorganize before pushing forward again. The Marines did not pull back. They walked over their own dead to keep moving. The ones in the back did not stop when the ones in the front went down. They moved to the side, found another angle, and kept going. He had never seen anything like it, and he had been a soldier for 6 years. Day 1, the point. On the northern end of the landing beach, a coral promontory called the Point commanded the entire beachhead with enfilading fire. It was one of the strongest individual positions on the island, a natural fortress reinforced with concrete and steel, with firing lanes covering every approach. Captain George Hunt led Company K of the 1st Marines against it on the first morning. By the time they took the point, Hunt had less than a platoon's worth of men still able to fight. He held the position through the night against repeated Japanese counterattacks with no adjacent units in contact and no artillery support. One tracked vehicle got through before dark to bring ammunition and evacuate the wounded. In the morning, the position was still in Marine hands. That was day 1. 72 more days followed, the first week. On the 6th day, the 1st Marine Regiment, one of the most decorated units in the history of the Corps, was withdrawn from the line. Colonel Lewis Puller had pushed his regiment into the Umabrogol for 6 days. They had taken ridgeline after ridgeline, cleared cave after cave, and lost 56% of their strength doing it. What was left could no longer function as a fighting unit. From inside the tunnel network, Nakagawa's observers reported the same thing in every direction. The Marines came back. You drove them off a position and they came back the next morning. You held a cave for 2 weeks against everything they threw at it, grenades, flamethrowers, demolition charges, bulldozers pushing coral rubble into the entrances. And when the cave finally fell, the men who took it moved immediately to the next one. There was no celebrating. There was no rest. There was just the next position. An anonymous diary recovered from a Palaliu cave and later studied by historians described the Americans at this stage of the fighting in language that had no equivalent in the writer's earlier entries. He reached for a word that Japanese soldiers typically used to describe themselves in their own moments of deepest resolution. Kakugo. It translates roughly as settled determination, the acceptance of what is coming and the decision to continue anyway. It was a word from the vocabulary of men who understand that there is no way out and who go forward regardless. He used it to describe the Marines, not as a compliment, as an observation. He was trying to name something he was watching happen outside his cave every day, and it was the only word he had that came close. The second week. The canteen water still tasted like oil. The coral cut through boot soles within days. Marines were fighting in makeshift wrappings of torn uniform cloth because their footwear had given out. The temperature did not drop. The Japanese snipers who emerged at night from tunnel exits behind American lines kept men from sleeping. The sound of flamethrowers working on the ridge face was constant. A Japanese soldier wrote that he could hear the Americans digging at night. Not attacking, not shouting or celebrating, digging, extending their foxholes, running wire, positioning their guns for the morning. He wrote that it reminded him of the way Japanese engineers prepared a siege, methodical, unhurried, as if there was no question about the outcome, and the only remaining work was the work itself. He had been told before the war that Americans could not be trusted to fight like that they would grow bored, that they would lose focus, that the prospect of death, sustained over weeks, would erode their will to push forward. He wrote that he no longer believed that. The final weeks. By late October, the 1st Marine Division had been withdrawn entirely and replaced by the Army's 81st Infantry Division. Nakagawa understood what this meant. It was not that the Marines had broken. It was that the Americans had an inexhaustible supply of men willing to do this kind of fighting. When one unit was spent, another arrived. The math he had given his men, 10 Marines for every Japanese soldier, was being fulfilled. The casualty numbers were real, and it was not enough. The water inside the caves was running out. The food was running out. The ammunition was running out. Tunnel sections were being sealed one by one. A charge placed at the entrance. A bulldozer pushing rubble until the opening was gone. The men inside it gone with it. One of the last diary entries recovered from the Umurbrogol was written by a man who gave no name and no unit. He wrote about his family in Osaka. He wrote about the smell of rain. He wrote that he had stopped being afraid, which he said was either a sign of courage or a sign that something in him had simply stopped working and that he was no longer sure which one it was. He did not write about surrender. None of the diaries did. Not one. The last organized Japanese resistance on Peleliu officially ended on November 27th. But not everyone accepted that. A band of 34 soldiers, 26 from Nakagawa's own 2nd Infantry Regiment and 8 naval personnel, had survived the battle in the caves and continued fighting under Lieutenant A. Yamaguchi. They did not believe Japan had surrendered. Leaflets dropped from aircraft, announcements over loudspeakers. They dismissed all of it as enemy tricks. In March of 1947, more than 2 years after the battle ended, Yamaguchi's group attacked a Marine patrol on the island with hand grenades. Only 150 Marines were stationed on Peleliu at that point, with 35 dependents. Reinforcements were called in. American authorities flew in a Japanese admiral specifically to convince the holdouts that the war was over. On April 21, 1947, Yamaguchi's group emerged from the jungle in 2 groups. Yamaguchi saluted, bowed, and handed over his sword and his unit's battle flags. They were the last men still keeping faith with the orders Nakagawa had given them, the last formal surrender of the Second World War. On the evening of November 24, 1944, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa sent his last message. It did not go by radio. The island's radio equipment had been destroyed weeks earlier. It went by underwater telephone cable, a line that ran from Peleliu to Japanese headquarters on the island of Koror, 25 miles to the southwest. He reported to his superiors, "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears." Then the operator at the Peleliu end of the line began sending the call sign for the Koror switchboard. "Sakura! Sakura! Sakura! Sack!" The line went dead. At Koror, General Inoue heard the voice stop and assumed the Americans had destroyed the command post with artillery. He did not know what had actually happened. What had happened was this. Nakagawa burned his regimental colors. He destroyed his command documents. He performed the ritual suicide of a Japanese officer whose position has been lost. His senior advisor, Major General Murai, died beside him. Tokyo received the report and promoted Nakagawa 2 full grades from colonel to lieutenant general posthumously. It was one of the highest honors the Imperial Japanese Army could bestow on a man who was already dead. When American soldiers searched the final cave complex in the days that followed, they found the ash of the burned flag. They found evidence of what had happened. They found no body. Nakagawa's remains have never been located. He lies somewhere in the coral of Peleliu. After 80 years, no one knows exactly where. The battle was declared secure on November 27th, 73 days after it was supposed to last 3. Of the approximately 10,900 Japanese defenders on the island, fewer than 300 survived as prisoners. Most of those were Korean laborers, not combat troops. The Marines and soldiers who took the island lost 9,800 killed and wounded, the highest casualty rate, measured against the size of the force engaged, of any American amphibious operation in the entire Pacific War. The National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, calls Peleliu the bitterest battle of the war for the Marines. Not the biggest, not the most famous, the bitterest. The Japanese lieutenant who wrote about the blood pounding in his veins on the morning of September 15th did not survive the battle. His diary was carried off the island and translated at Marine Corps headquarters. The men he described in those last pages, the ones who kept walking, the ones who came back to the same ridgeline day after day, most of them went home to the United States and did not talk about Peleliu much. It was not the famous battle. It was not Iwo Jima. It did not have the photograph. What it had was 73 days of men doing the hardest kind of work, against an enemy who had spent 5 months studying exactly what they were capable of and building the most complete answer anyone in that war ever built. In April of 2015, Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko of Japan traveled to Peleliu, the first time a Japanese emperor had set foot on the island. They laid white chrysanthemums at the Japanese memorial. Then they walked to the American memorial and did the same. They stood on the same coral ground that Nakagawa had walked in 1944, the ground above the tunnels that still run beneath the island, still sealed, still there. His body is somewhere in that coral, in the dark below Bloody Nose Ridge, where no one has found it in 80 years. The Marines he was waiting for, their names are on the wall at Quantico. If your father or grandfather served at Peleliu, the 1st Marines, the 5th, the 7th, or the Army's 81st Infantry, leave their name and unit in the comments. Those names belong to this story. They deserve to be written down.
Fall of 1943. Georgia Institute of Technology, Atlanta, Georgia. An 18-year-old sat at a desk in an examination room and deliberately wrote down the wrong answers. Not because he didn't know them. His father was one of the most respected physicians in Mobile. The boy had grown up in a house full of books, full of discipline, full of quiet expectations about what a young man from a family like his was supposed to do with his life. He knew exactly what the right answers were. He wrote down the wrong ones anyway. The examination was for an officer training program, the kind that would keep him in a classroom for another 2 years, while the war was already being fought and lost, and fought again on islands halfway around the world. His best friend had already shipped out to Guadalcanal. Letters were coming back from that island. Not all the men sending them were still alive. He did not want to spend 2 more years in a classroom, so he failed the exam on purpose. His father found out. His father let him go. 2 years later, that same young man stood on the deck of a landing craft, looking out at a small coral island that no one back home in Alabama had ever heard of. In his shirt pocket was a pocket-sized New Testament, the kind issued to every man at Camp Elliott during basic training. He had not brought it to pray. He pulled out a pencil and opened it to the margins. The Marine Corps forbade keeping a diary. If you were captured, a journal could cost lives. He kept one anyway. His name was Eugene Sledge. He was 20 years old, and somewhere inside the island in front of him, deep inside 500 caves carved into limestone, a Japanese colonel named Kunio Nakagawa had been waiting for 6 months. Nakagawa had planned for everything, almost everything. Eugene Sledge grew up in a house called Georgia Cottage. It sat on Spring Hill Avenue in Mobile, a Greek revival home built in the 1840s, the kind of place that had survived the Civil War and the century after it, shaded by oaks, set back from the road, with the particular stillness of a family that had lived in one place long enough to know who they were. His father, Dr. Edward Sledge, had a practice that served anyone who came through the door, white or black, wealthy or not. In Mobile, Alabama, in the 1930s, that was not the common thing. Eugene was the younger son. He was small as a boy, frail even. Rheumatic fever had hit him hard enough that he lost 2 full years of school, and left behind a heart murmur that would follow him for years. The family's plan was straightforward: college, then medicine, then a life like his father's. He enrolled at Marion Military Institute in the fall of 1942, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and then Guadalcanal happened. And then his closest friend, Sidney Phillips, shipped out with the Marines, and letters started arriving from a jungle island 12,000 miles away, and Eugene Sledge sat in his dormitory room and understood, in the specific and irreversible way that 20-year-olds understand things, that the war was happening without him. He applied to the V-12 officer training program. He was accepted. He went to Georgia Tech. And then, in his first semester, he and half his detachment sat down together and deliberately failed their exams, every one of them, so they would be reclassified as enlisted men and sent to the Pacific immediately instead of 2 years later. He wanted to fight, not to be a hero, not because he had thought through what fighting actually looked like. He just could not stand the waiting. In December 1942, he was sworn in as a private in the United States Marine Corps. He was 19 years old. He would not be the same person when he came home. By the summer of 1944, Sledge had been assigned to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. The 1st Marine Division was the oldest, most storied division in the Corps. They had held Guadalcanal. They had slugged through the jungles of Cape Gloucester. They were, by almost any measure, the finest amphibious infantry force the United States had ever put into the field. Their commanding general was Major General William Rupertus. Before the men boarded their ships, Rupertus called his officers together. He looked them in the eye. He told them Peleliu would be, and these are his exact words, a fast one, rough but fast. "We'll be through in 3 days," he said. "It may only take 2. He was so confident that he did not arrange for reserve infantry support. He did not request reinforcements standing by. He told the Army's 81st Infantry Division, the unit assigned to support operations in the area, to go take a nearby island called Angkor instead. He would not need them. The 1st Marine Division would handle Peleliu alone. When the landing craft hit the beach on the morning of September 15th, 1944, Rupertus was not among them. He had broken his ankle before the operation began. He watched from the command ship offshore. He waited for word that the island had fallen. What Rupertus did not know, what no one on the American side knew, was that the Japanese on Peleliu were not going to fight the way they had fought anywhere else. After Guadalcanal, after Tarawa, after Saipan. The Japanese Imperial General Staff had looked hard at why they kept losing, and they had reached a conclusion that was, in its own way, completely rational. Charging American machine guns accomplished nothing except filling American ammunition belts. Defending the beaches put your men in the open, in direct sight of American warships standing offshore. The old way was finished. The new way was this: go underground. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had arrived on Peleliu 6 months earlier with a team of engineers and a directive to turn the island into something that had never existed before in the Pacific War. The Umurbrugol, a ridge of limestone coral running along the northern half of the island, was honeycombed with natural caves. Nakagawa's engineers went to work. 500 cave positions, steel blast doors that could be slid shut after each gun fired, so American ships offshore had nothing to aim at. Tunnels connecting position to position, so men could move unseen beneath the ground. Artillery pieces mounted on rails, rolled to the mouth of the cave to fire, rolled back inside before the smoke cleared. The beaches were not the defense. The beaches were the invitation. The real killing ground was the ridge. The first wave of Marines hit the beach at 8 o'clock in the morning. By the end of that first day, Before the sun went down, 1,100 Americans had been killed or wounded. 1,100 men in one day. On an island the commanding general had said would fall in 2 days, Eugene Sledge waded ashore with Company K and moved inland toward the sound of everything that was happening ahead of him. He reached into his shirt pocket. He found the pocket testament. He opened it to a blank page in the back. He began to write. He would not stop writing until the island was behind him. The Marines had a name for the Umurbergal. They called it Bloody Nose Ridge. Nobody sat down and chose that name. It came from the men who had been there, passed from unit to unit in the way that names come from the men who earned them, without ceremony, without anyone writing it down in an order. If you wanted to understand what that ridge was like, you didn't need a map. You just had to look at the face of a man walking back from it. If he was walking back. On the northern end of the landing beach, a promontory of rock jutted out into the water. The Marines called it the Point. Nakagawa had positioned heavy guns there, guns that covered the entire northern approach to the beach. As long as the point held, every boat, every ship, every landing craft coming in from that direction was in range. Captain George Hunt of the 1st Marine Regiment was given the order to take it. He went in with 235 men. They took it. They fought for it for 30 straight hours. Nakagawa hit them 4 times, 4 major counterattacks, from positions inside the rock that Hunt's men hadn't known existed before the first shots came out of them. No water resupply. No ammunition resupply. 115 degrees on the open coral. When reinforcements finally reached the point, 235 men had become 18. 18 men. They had not pulled back. Not one step. On the command ship offshore, General Rupertus was receiving casualty reports. By day 5, his staff officers sat down with the numbers and told him plainly, the division needed the army. The 81st Infantry Division was sitting offshore. They had already taken Angkor. They were available. They were ready. Rupertus said no. He had been commanding Marines his entire career. He was not going to call in army soldiers. Not for this. Not for any island. Not while his Marines were still on their feet. One of his junior officers wrote a letter home around this time. He didn't put his name on it. He wrote, they would never call in the army like this, because it would hurt the name of the Marine Corps, he supposed, to let the world know that regular army reinforcements had to be called in so early. On the ridge, Sledge and the men of Company K, 5th Regiment, kept climbing. There is a particular kind of fighting that has no name in any field manual. It is not the charge. It is not the defense. It is the kind where you take 10 yards, and then you hold those 10 yards against everything that comes back at you from positions you cannot see, from men you cannot find, inside rock that was there long before either side showed up. That was Bloody Nose Ridge. The caves did not look like caves from the outside. They looked like shadows in the limestone. A Marine would advance. Nothing. Another step. Nothing. Then the shadow would open up, and the fire would come from a direction that made no tactical sense, until you understood that the man shooting at you was 30 feet underground and had been waiting there since before the ships appeared on the horizon. Flamethrowers. Grenades rolled into openings in the rock. Demolition teams sealing entrances with explosive charges. Each position taken, one at a time. Each one its own separate fight. The temperature on the coral never dropped below 90 degrees, even at night. The water was never enough. The smell of the island, coral dust, diesel, and something else that the men who were there would spend the rest of their lives trying not to think about, settled into everything. Into their clothes, into their hair, into the pages of a small New Testament that one man from Mobile, Alabama kept opening and closing in the moments between. After 5 days of fighting, the 1st Marine Regiment had taken 1,749 casualties. 1,749 men. That number meant something specific, and the officers on the ground knew exactly what it meant. It was the same number, almost exactly, as the total casualties suffered by the entire 1st Marine Division during all 6 months of Guadalcanal. 6 months. 5 days. The 1st Marines had fought themselves down to the edge of what a regiment could be, and still be called a regiment. Rupertus still had not called for army reinforcements. He still believed the ridge would break. He still believed the island would fall. He ordered the 1st Marines to keep pushing. Eugene Sledge wrote in his testament that week. He wrote about the men around him, not their heroics, not their last words, not the things that get written in citations and reports. He wrote about the small things, the way the temperature dropped 2 degrees just before dawn, enough that you noticed it, enough that it meant something for about 20 minutes before the sun came back up and the heat settled over the island again, like a lid closing. The sound of the coral cracking under mortar fire. The particular silence after a position was taken, the few seconds before the next position opened up. He wrote, "I thought of the thousands of sane, normal people back home playing cards, reading the funnies, or going to the movies. And here we are." He was not complaining. He was not asking for anything. He was just marking the distance, the exact, unmeasurable distance between the life he had left in Mobile and the thing he was standing inside of now. The men who read those words decades later, the historians, the veterans, the sons and grandsons, said the same thing. They said he wrote exactly what it felt like. Exactly. Deep inside the Umurbrogol, Nakagawa was also writing. His first dispatch to Tokyo went out in those early days. He did not report a victory. He reported what he had observed, the number of positions taken, the number of counterattacks absorbed, the rate at which his defensive lines were being compressed. And then, almost as a separate matter, he noted something he did not have a satisfactory explanation for. The Americans were not stopping, not when their water ran out, not when their ammunition ran low, not when the casualty reports reached numbers that, by any previous standard of this war, should have produced a withdrawal. They were not stopping. He filed his report. The Emperor's first telegram arrived shortly after, then the second, then the third. In Tokyo, they called it a victory in progress. In the caves of the Umurbrogol, Nakagawa knew what it was. He had designed the perfect defense. He had calculated everything correctly. He had not calculated for this. On September 21st, General Roy Geiger came ashore. Geiger commanded the 3rd Amphibious Corps, Rupertus reported to him. He walked the lines. He looked at the men. He looked at the numbers. Then he did what Rupertus had refused to do. He ordered the 321st Infantry Regiment of the Army's 81st Division to land on Peleliu. It was not a request. Rupertus could not stop it. The 1st Marine Regiment, the regiment that had taken the point, that had gone into the Umurbrogol on the first day and had not come back out whole, was pulled from the line. They walked to the beach in silence. 1,749 men had gone in. What came out was not a regiment anymore. It was the men who were left. They boarded their ships. The island was still not taken. Sledge and the 5th Regiment stayed. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that is not about sleep. It accumulates over days, not from any single thing, but from the compounding weight of every small thing together. The heat that never breaks. The sound that becomes so constant it stops being sound and becomes something closer to weather, just a condition of the air, a property of being alive on this particular piece of ground. Sledge had been on Peleliu for more than a week. He was 20 years old. He had grown up in a house on Spring Hill Avenue where his mother cooked dinner and his father read the evening paper, and the worst sound in the neighborhood was a screen door closing too hard in the summer heat. He was still that person. He had not stopped being that person. That was the thing nobody back home could quite understand later. Not that the men who came back were changed, but that they were both things at once. The boy from Mobile and the man who had been on the ridge, both, at the same time, always. He kept writing, not every day, not in any organized way, in the margins of the testament, on the blank pages at the back, wherever the pencil fit. He wrote about a young Marine he did not know by name, couldn't have been more than 18, sitting against the base of a limestone wall one memory, from the specific, irreplaceable kind of memory that only exists when someone who was there is still alive to carry it. There are men from that generation, men who were on Peleliu, on Okinawa, on every island that had a name nobody back home could pronounce, who came home and sat at dinner tables with their families, and sometimes, in the middle of a meal, they would say half a sentence, and then stop, and move on to something else. If your grandfather was one of those men, if your father was, if you grew up hearing the edge of a story that was never finished, I want to hear it. Leave it in the comments. One sentence is enough. Because the stories that were told at dinner tables, in living rooms, in the quiet moments that didn't make it into any official record, those are the ones that tell you what it actually was. And if they're not written down somewhere, if they only exist in the memory of the people sitting here right now, then when that generation is gone, those stories go with them. Don't let that happen. Morning, July 24th, 1944. Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata picks up a pen and writes a telegram to Tokyo. His men have just repelled 100 American landing barges off the coast of Tinian town. The beach is held. The Americans turned back. He seals the message and sends it. Then he waits for the next attack, the real one, the one he has been preparing for since the day he arrived on this island. What Ogata does not know, what no one will tell him until it is already too late, is that those barges were empty. Every single one of them. There were no Marines in them. Not one. While 9,000 of his men stood at the southern beaches, rifles up, watching the water, 15,000 United States Marines were already climbing out of the sea, 3 miles to the north. On 2 beaches so narrow, so obviously impossible to use, that Ogata had never once pointed a gun at them. He had looked at those beaches. He had measured them. He had walked his officers down to the water's edge, looked north at those 2 thin strips of coral, and made a decision that every military mind on that island, Japanese and American alike, would have made. Nothing can land there. He was the last person on Tinian to find out he was wrong. If that's the first time you're hearing this story, you're not alone. Hit that like button right now. It's the only reason stories like this one find the people who should have heard them 40 years ago. But here is the part the history books leave out entirely. That landing on those 2 impossible beaches almost never happened. Not because of the Japanese, because of an American admiral who was ordered, twice, by his own commanding officer to stop planning it. His name was Harry Hill, and the decision he refused to walk away from saved 15,000 American lives. To understand what Hill did, you first have to understand what Tinian was, and what it cost. Tinian is a small flat island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. 39 square miles. If you flew over it in the summer of 1944, it would look like an aircraft carrier sitting on the surface of the sea. Long, flat, ringed by cliffs, with a series of airfields already carved into the coral. That image was not a coincidence. That is exactly what Washington intended to make it. From Tinian, a B-29 superfortress could fly directly to Tokyo. No refueling stop, no intermediate airfield, no margin of error eaten up by a long detour south. Just a straight line across the Pacific, roughly 1,500 miles, and then Japan. For the first time in the entire war, every city in the Japanese home islands would be within reach of American bombers. Tokyo knew that. They had known it for months. By the summer of 1944, 9,000 Japanese troops were dug into Tinian's southern end. And these were not garrison soldiers counting the days on a quiet island. Colonel Ogata's 50th Infantry Regiment had come from Manchuria. These men had fought in China. They had survived years of combat on the Asian mainland, the kind of fighting that strips away everything that isn't necessary, and leaves only the soldiers who know how to stay alive. Ogata knew what he had, and he knew what was coming. The terrain of Tinian was almost a gift to a defending army. Most of the coastline was sheer coral cliffs. No beach, no approach, no way in. Tall enough in places to make an amphibious landing not just difficult, but suicidal. Only a few points along the shore offered any access at all. The biggest and most obvious was Sunharan Harbor on the island's southwestern coast, Tinian Town, wide beaches, a working port, the only stretch of shoreline where a large force could come ashore and be supplied afterward. Every Japanese officer on that island knew the Americans would come through there. Every American planner looking at the maps reached the same conclusion. If you were going to take Tinian, Tinian Town was where you landed. It was the only answer that made sense. Ogata accepted that answer and built his entire defense around it. He moved his artillery to the high ground above the harbor. He strung concertina wire across the approaches. He sited machine gun nests in the coconut groves behind the waterline. He laid mines in the water offshore. He built concrete blockhouses facing the sea. He carved firing positions into the cliffs on either side of the bay, so that any force coming through the harbor entrance would be caught in a crossfire from 3 directions at once. Month after month his men worked, digging, hauling, mixing concrete in the Pacific heat. Every decision, every position, every yard of wire, all of it pointed toward one question. When the Americans come, where will they come from? Ogata had his answer. Tinian Town. He was certain of it. He was not wrong to be certain. Every rule of warfare pointed to the same place. Every logical reading of the terrain led to the same conclusion. He built the right defense for the right threat at the right location. The only thing he did not account for was one American admiral who looked at the same island, read the same maps, and saw something nobody else was willing to see. His name was Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill. His job was to get the Marines onto Tinian. He sat down with the maps the way a man does when he's not looking for what he expects to find, but for what everyone else might have missed. The Tinian Town beaches were wide. They were accessible. They had a working harbor behind them that could handle the tonnage an operation this size would need. They were also the beaches where Colonel Ogata had spent the last several months building everything he had into a single, focused wall of fire. Concrete blockhouses, artillery on the high ground, machine gun positions cut into the cliffs on either side, mines in the water offshore, wire in the surf. Landing at Tinian Town wasn't a plan. It was a funeral. Hill kept looking at the map. Up on the northwest coast, far from the harbor, far from Tinian Town, far from everything Ogata had turned his attention toward. There were 2 small notches in the cliffs. White Beach 1, White Beach 2. White Beach 1 was 60 yards wide. 60 yards. That is roughly the distance from home plate to second base on a baseball diamond. White Beach 2 was about 120 yards, a little more room, but not much. Both beaches were flanked by low coral cliffs that dropped straight into the water. Both were essentially undefended. The Japanese had looked at those 2 strips of sand and coral and reached the same conclusion that every trained military mind would reach. Nothing large enough to matter could possibly land there. Hill took his proposal to Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Turner was the senior amphibious commander in the entire United States Navy. He had planned and led the landings at Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok. The men who served under him had a name for him, Terrible Turner. Not because he was cruel to the enemy, because he had no patience for anyone who brought him an idea he had already decided was wrong. Hill laid out the White Beach proposal. Turner looked at the map. Then he looked at Hill. Not wide enough to sustain a landing force, he said. Not wide enough to keep them supplied. The plan is Tinian Town. That's the order. Stop planning anything else. Hill went back to his flagship. He did not argue. He did not file a formal objection. He did what he was told. And then, quietly, he set up a second planning team, separate from the first, working in parallel, looking at nothing but the white beaches. Most men in his position would have let it go. Turner wasn't just a superior officer. He was the most experienced amphibious commander in the United States Navy. Disagreeing with him wasn't a career risk. It was the kind of thing that followed a man for the rest of his life. The admiral who second-guessed Turner and turned out to be wrong. Nobody knew about the second team but Hill and the men on it. But opinion wasn't going to be enough. What Hill needed was hard data. Numbers that could be measured and verified. Information that Turner couldn't dismiss as a hunch. He needed someone to actually go there, in the dark, in the water, close enough to count the rocks. The night of July 10th, Captain James Jones led Company A of the Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion off the side of a ship and into black rubber boats that had no lights, no markings, and made as little sound as possible on the open water. With them were swimmers from Navy Underwater Demolition Team 7, UDT men, trained to work in the surf zone while everyone else was still ashore. Their orders were straightforward. Get to the white beaches, measure the water depth, find the mines, determine whether an LVT, a landing vehicle tracked, could negotiate the reef and make it to shore. Come back with numbers. They carried measuring equipment, waterproof paper, and standing orders to make no noise under any circumstances. The tide that night was stronger than anyone had calculated. The team assigned to White Beach, one was pushed off course before they could reach the shore. They couldn't fight the current without making noise. They turned around. The team assigned to White Beach, 2 drifted north in the dark, and came ashore on White Beach, 1 by mistake. They had enough time to make a quick visual survey before they had to pull back ahead of first light. Both teams returned to the ship with almost nothing to show for it. No clean numbers, no definitive reading on the reef, no answer that Hill could take to Turner. The following night, 10 swimmers from Company A went back in. This time, they found the right beach. They swam in close enough that they could hear, clearly and distinctly, Japanese voices from the patrol walking the cliff edge above them. The water was cold. The coral cut their hands as they worked. They measured the depth at the reef line. They checked the seafloor for mines, for obstacles, for anything that would stop a column of amphibious vehicles from reaching the sand. The Japanese patrol walked back and forth 20 feet above their heads. Not one of those soldiers looked down. The report came back the next morning. The UDT's conclusion was direct. No mines or man-made underwater obstructions were found. The water depth at the reef was workable. The reef itself could be crossed if the LVTs were fitted with ramps. Metal ramps that could fold down onto the coral cliffs and let the vehicles drive straight up onto the beach. The beaches were small. The approach was tight, but it could be done. Hill brought the report to Turner. This time, he had measurements. He had a UDT assessment signed by the team leader. He had a technical answer to every objection Turner had raised. Turner read it. Then he told Hill to stop. Not a suggestion, not a reconsideration. A direct order, final and unambiguous, to end all White Beach planning immediately. The matter was closed. Hill did not go back to his ship. He went ashore on Saipan and found Lieutenant General Howland Smith. Howlin' Mad Smith, commander of the ground forces for the entire operation. Smith had been in favor of the White Beaches from the beginning, but Smith didn't have the authority to override an amphibious fleet commander on a question of where ships land. He could agree with Hill. He could walk alongside him. That was all. Hill kept going. He sent word up the chain past Turner entirely, directly to Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the 5th Fleet, the man above Turner, the man whose word on this operation was final. He reported that the disagreement between senior commanders was placing the entire mission at risk. This was not a difference of opinion between colleagues. This was a subordinate officer going over his superior's head in the middle of a combat operation. In the United States Navy in 1944, that was the kind of action that ended careers. He did it with his name on it. Spruance called a conference. Every senior officer involved in the Tinian operation was ordered to attend, Navy and Marines together, in one room, on one ship. Turner was there. Admiral Spruance ran the meeting the way the United States Navy had always run important meetings. He went around the room and asked each officer for his recommendation, starting with the most junior man present and working his way up. The junior officers spoke first. The senior officers listened. No one knew, going in, this is what it is. This is what is happening. This is where we are. Decades later, when the historian Paul Fussell read Sledge's account, Fussell, who had fought in Europe, who had written some of the most unflinching work ever produced about what war actually does to the men inside it, he called the book one of the finest memoirs ever written about combat. Not just about the Pacific, about war. Any war. Sledge himself wrote about what had kept him going, not in the abstract, not philosophically, but in the specific moments when everything in a man's body is telling him to stop. He said it wasn't patriotism. It wasn't hatred of the enemy. It was the man on his left. It was the man on his right. He could not leave while they were still there. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Nakagawa had built his defense around a simple truth of warfare. Every army has a breaking point. You find it by making the cost high enough, long enough, that continuing becomes more painful than stopping. He had made the cost very high. He had been making it very high for weeks. The breaking point had not come. He had designed the perfect system for defeating an army. He had not designed it to defeat men who would not leave each other. By late November, Nakagawa had 56 men. 56 from the 10,000 who had been on the island when the Marines landed. He had been receiving telegrams from the Emperor since the first week of the battle. The 4th, the 5th, the 6th. Each one arrived. Each one acknowledged his sacrifice. Each one contained no ships, no aircraft, no men. There was nothing left in Japan to send. There had not been for some time. Nakagawa understood this. He had understood it for a while. He sent his final dispatch. Our sword is broken, and we have run out of spears. He divided his 56 men into 17 small groups. He gave each group a direction. He told them to attack. Then he burned the regimental colors. Then he sent a final coded signal to Army headquarters. 3 words: Sakura, Sakura, Sakura. Cherry blossoms. The signal that the island had fallen, and that the man sending it would not be reporting again. Then he and his second-in-command took their own lives. The Emperor posthumously promoted him to Lieutenant General. 11 telegrams had been sent. No one had come. On November 27th, 1944, 73 days after the first wave of Marines hit the beach, Peleliu was declared secure. 9,800 American casualties. 10,700 Japanese dead. One small island, 8 square miles in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. After the war, military historians spent years arguing about Peleliu, whether it was necessary, whether the cost was worth it. Admiral Halsey had recommended canceling the invasion before it began. The Japanese garrison was already cut off, he argued, already irrelevant to the larger campaign. Nimitz overruled him. The argument has never been fully settled, but there is one thing that happened because of those 73 days that does not appear in most accounts of the battle. It is a small thing, or it seems small until you know what it is. On the 2nd of August, 1945, 9 months after Peleliu was declared secure, a Navy patrol plane took off from the airfield on the island. The pilot was Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn. It was a routine flight, a search pattern over open water. About halfway through his route, Gwynn looked down and saw something in the ocean that should not have been there. He dropped altitude. He circled. In the water below him, scattered across several miles of open Pacific, were men. 316 men. They had been in the water for 4 days. They were the survivors of the USS Indianapolis, the heavy cruiser that had been struck by Japanese torpedoes on the 30th of July and had sunk in 12 minutes. No distress signal had been received. No one had reported the ship overdue. No search had been launched. For 4 days, 316 men had been in the open ocean, and no one on the American side knew they were there. Gwynn's plane, flying out of Peleliu, found them. Within hours, rescue ships were on the way. Those 316 men came home because a patrol plane happened to fly over that stretch of water on that particular morning. That patrol plane flew out of an airfield on an island that had cost 9,800 American casualties to take. Whether those numbers balance, that is not a calculation anyone can make cleanly. But the men in the water didn't have to make it. They just came home. There is one more thing about Peleliu that the history books record, but rarely dwell on. Nakagawa's tactics did not die with him on that island. Every Japanese commander in the Pacific studied what he had done. The 500 caves, the sliding steel doors, the guns on rails, the defense built into the rock itself instead of along the beach. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the same system, deeper, more extensive. Refined by everything Nakagawa had learned across 73 days of being taken apart, position by men who refused to stop. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima in February of 1945 walked into a defense that had been built, in part, on the lessons of Peleliu, and they took that island too, and Okinawa, every island, every time. Nakagawa had given his successors his best work. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The men of the 1st Marine Division received the Presidential Unit Citation for their service on Peleliu. The citation described their conduct as marked by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. There are not better words. But they are not the words that stay with you when you read what those men wrote about themselves. What Sledge wrote, what the others who kept their own notes wrote, the letters that made it home, and the ones that didn't. What stays with you is simpler. An island gave them every reason to stop. They didn't stop. Eugene Sledge came home to Mobile in the fall of 1945. He walked back into the house on Spring Hill Avenue. His parents were there. His father, the doctor who had let him go, who had signed nothing and said nothing to stop him, was there. Sledge did not tell them what he had seen. Not that night. Not in the weeks after. Not in any complete way. Some of it he could not find words for yet. Some of it he could find words for, but understood, with the quiet certainty that comes from having been somewhere most people haven't, that no arrangement of words would carry it across the distance between where he had been and where they were sitting. He put the pocket testament in a drawer. He enrolled at Auburn. He studied business administration, not what his father had hoped for, but something. He graduated in 1949. He went back for a master's degree, then a doctorate in biology from the University of Florida. In the summer of 1962, he was appointed assistant professor at Alabama College in Montevallo, 40 miles north of Mobile, a small school, the kind of place where a professor knows his students' names and organizes field trips to the wetlands along the bay, and is known after 20 years as the one who always stops to identify a bird. His students knew he was particular about things. They knew he expected careful work. They didn't ask where he had been. It was his wife, Jeanne, who finally asked him to write it down. Not for anyone else. For himself. She had watched him wake in the night for years, not dramatically, not in the way it gets written in books, just quietly, sitting up in the dark for a few minutes before lying back down. She understood, the way a person understands something they have lived alongside for a long time, that what happened on Peleliu had never fully left the room. She asked him to write it. He started in the late 1970s. His son John said later that his father wrote the book the way a man takes dictation, fast, almost compulsively, getting up in the middle of the night to put down another page because the words had been waiting for 35 years, and now that the door was open, they came out whether he was ready or not. The working title was Into the Abyss. He changed it. He called it With the Old Breed. It was published in 1981 by a small academic press that specialized in military history. It did not have a large first printing. It was not reviewed widely. And then, slowly, it found its readers. Veterans who had been there and recognized every line. Sons and grandsons who had grown up with fathers who didn't talk, and who found, in Sledge's words, the closest thing they would ever get to an explanation of why. Historians who understood they were reading something that could not be reconstructed from official records. Because official records do not contain the Marine sitting against the limestone wall holding a photograph he couldn't look at. Paul Fussell called it one of the finest books ever written about the experience of war. Victor Davis Hanson wrote an introduction to a later edition. Ken Burns used it as source material for his documentary on World War II. HBO turned it into a miniseries watched by millions. Sledge lived to see some of that. He died in Montevallo, Alabama, on the 3rd of March, 2001. Stomach cancer. He was 77 years old. He is buried at Pine Crest Cemetery in Mobile, the same city he left as a 19-year-old who couldn't stand the waiting, in the same county where his father had practiced medicine, a few miles from the house on Spring Hill Avenue. He had written, near the end of With the Old Breed, "I am haunted by the vision of those Marines. I mourn their loss to this day." Sledge kept those notes for 37 years before anyone read them. He kept them because he believed that the men he had served with, the ones who didn't come home, and the ones who came home and never spoke, deserved to be remembered by more than a number in a casualty report. If this story is doing that for you right now, if you feel like these men deserve to be heard by more people, a like takes 1 second. That's all it takes to help this reach someone who needs to hear it. Peleliu today has about 700 residents. The airfield the Marines died to take is still there, overgrown now, returned mostly to jungle. On the beach where the landing craft came in on the morning of September 15th, 1944, there are still rusted hulks of American amphibious tractors half buried in the sand. In the Moorburgel, in the caves of Bloody Nose Ridge, the walls still carry the marks of what happened there. No one cleaned them off. No one covered them over. They are just there, in the rock, the way some things stay. Every year, Americans make the trip to that island. Some of them are veterans. Some are the children of veterans. Some are the grandchildren of men who came home from that island and sat down at dinner tables and said almost nothing for the rest of their lives. They stand on the ridge. They look down at the beach. They don't need anyone to tell them what happened here. They already know. Sledge wrote his book because he was afraid those men would disappear, not just from the history books, from memory, from the specific, irreplaceable kind of memory that only exists when someone who was there is still alive to carry it. There are men from that generation, men who were on Peleliu, on Okinawa, on every island that had a name nobody back home could pronounce, who came home and sat at dinner tables with their families, and sometimes, in the middle of a meal, they would say half a sentence, and the Navy had always run important meetings. He went around the room and asked each officer for his recommendation, starting with the most junior man present and working his way up. The junior officers spoke first. The senior officers listened. No one knew, going in, what the man above him would say. The first officer spoke. White beaches. The second officer spoke. White beaches. One by one, down the line, every man in that room gave the same answer. An officer who was present that day recalled afterward that as the list moved closer to Turner, the last man, the most senior man, the man who had twice given the order to stop, the room got very quiet. Not the quiet of men waiting for something routine, the quiet of men who understood exactly what was about to happen. He said you could hear the vibration of the ship's engines coming up through the floor. Turner listened to all of it. When it was his turn, the last man asked, the highest-ranking officer in the room, he looked at Spruance and announced calmly that he favored the white beaches. Nobody said a word. Turner later wrote about this moment in a letter to historians. He said he had always intended to land on the white beaches, that his earlier objections were simply part of a thorough process of eliminating alternatives. Whether that is true is not something anyone can know for certain. What is certain is that Hill never believed it. In his own papers, now held at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, Hill wrote about the weeks before the Tinian landing without bitterness, but with precision. He documented every refusal, every order to stand down, every meeting where the White Beach argument was put forward and dismissed. He kept the records the way a man keeps records when he wants history to have the full picture. Because Hill understood something that does not appear in the official account. The landing worked not because the plan was approved. It worked because one officer refused to let it be buried before it ever had a chance. July 20th, 1944. The official order came down. White beaches. The landing was set for July 24th, 4 days. Ogata was not informed. On the night of July 23rd, the fleet left Saipan. 3.5 miles of open water separated the two islands, one of the shortest ship-to-shore distances in the history of amphibious warfare. The Marines could see Tinian from the deck. They had been looking at it for weeks from across the channel, watching the bombardment, watching the smoke rise, knowing they were going next. Now they were going. 3:30 in the morning, July 24th. The first ships moved, but not all of them moved north. The 2nd Marine Division turned south, toward Tinian Town, toward Sun Heron Harbor, toward exactly the beach that every Japanese soldier on that island had been told to defend. Landing craft went into the water. Engines turned over. 22 boats formed up in the darkness and drove straight at the shore. The Japanese coastal batteries had been waiting for exactly this. 3 6-inch guns, hidden in caves behind Tinian Town, opened fire at 7:40 in the morning. The battleship USS Colorado took 22 direct hits. The destroyer USS Norman Scott maneuvered between the batteries and Colorado to draw the fire away. She took 6 shells in a matter of seconds. Commander Seymour Owens, her captain, was killed at his post on the bridge. 22 of his men died with him. The feint was bloodier than anyone had expected. It was also working. Colonel Ogata stood at his position above Tinian town and raised his binoculars. He saw what he had prepared for. American landing craft moving toward his beaches. His men were in position. His guns were ready. The months of work, the concrete, the wire, the carefully sighted firing positions, all of it was about to do exactly what it was built to do. He gave the order to open fire. Every gun on the southern coast of Tinian turned toward the water. 3 miles to the north, in a direction that no one on Tinian was looking, the first wave of the 4th Marine Division crossed the line of departure in the early morning darkness and headed for White Beach 1 and White Beach 2. The LVTs had been modified in the days before the landing. Metal ramps had been welded to their bows, ramps that could fold down onto the coral cliffs and allow the vehicles to drive straight up out of the water onto the beach. This had never been done before in the Pacific War. The approach to White Beach 2 had mines in the water. 3 LVTs were destroyed. A jeep went with them. The rest kept moving. The 1st Marines stepped onto Tinian as the sun was still rising. Then came the tanks. Then came the artillery. Then came thousands more. Sometime that morning, while the landing was still underway, while the Marines were pushing inland from the northern beaches, Colonel Ogata composed a telegram and sent it to Tokyo. His forces had repelled 100 American landing barges off the coast of Tinian town. The beaches had held. The Americans had turned back. He reported it as a victory. By the time that message arrived in Tokyo, American forces had pushed a mile deep into Tinian's interior. The beachhead was 1.5 miles wide. By the end of that day, July 24th, 1944, 15,614 United States Marines and sailors were standing on Tinian. The Japanese garrison on that island did not lose because they lacked courage. They did not lose because they were unprepared, or undermanned, or caught asleep. They lost because every preparation they made, every gun they positioned, every yard of wire they strung, had been aimed at a single answer to a single question. Where will the Americans land? They had the right answer. The Americans simply refused to go there. 2 in the morning. July 25th. The beachhead was less than a day old. Ogata understood exactly what had happened. He had been outmaneuvered. His defense had been made irrelevant before a single shot was fired at the positions he had spent months building. But the island was not lost yet. The Marines were on a narrow strip of ground with their backs to the water. They hadn't had time to dig in properly. They hadn't had time to bring up everything they needed. Doctrine was clear. Hit them now, in the dark, before they can consolidate. Drive them back into the sea. Ogata committed the best of what he had left, infantry, naval troops, tanks, from multiple directions, all at once, into the Marine perimeter. The Marines were waiting for them. 37mm anti-tank guns had been set up behind the line. Machine guns were pre-sighted on the approaches. Artillery from Saipan, 13 batteries of it, firing across the channel, had pre-registered coordinates on every likely avenue of attack. The Japanese came, and the Marines held. When daylight came on July 25th, more than 1,200 Japanese soldiers lay in front of the Marine positions. 5 tanks had been destroyed. Ogata's best assault troops, the men from Manchuria, the veterans who had survived years of combat, were gone in a single night. The counterattack that was supposed to end the battle had instead decided it. The 2nd Marine Division came ashore on July 25th, over the same white beaches. 2 divisions now, pushing south. The 4th Marine Division on the west side of the island. The 2nd Marine Division on the east. Day by day, they worked through what Tinian had left. The sugarcane fields were dense enough that a man could disappear into them from 10 feet away. The coral caves along the cliffs had to be taken one at a time. Grenades first, then a man at the entrance, then another man going in. The concrete bunkers along the approaches to Tinian town had been built to stop a landing from the sea. The Marines came at them from behind. July 30th. The 4th Marine Division entered Tinian town. The buildings Ogata had fortified, the firing lanes he had cut through the coconut groves, the positions he had built to kill Americans coming off the beach. Every one of them faced the wrong direction. By the morning of August 1st, 1944, Ogata had nothing left but the cliffs at the southern end of the island, and the men willing to die with him. He led the last resistance himself. He died on August 1st, the same day the island was declared secured. 9 days. From the moment the first LVT touched the coral at White Beach, one to the moment the last organized resistance collapsed at the southern cliffs. 9 days. 290 United States Marines and sailors killed, 1,515 wounded, 5,745 Japanese soldiers dead. Afterward, Lieutenant General Holland Smith looked at what his men had done and wrote the words that would follow this battle for the rest of history. The most perfect amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Harry Hill's name does not appear in that sentence. The guns stopped on August 1st. The Seabees, the Navy construction battalions, had been working since before the guns stopped. They moved through the sugarcane with bulldozers, flattening fields that 2 weeks earlier had hidden Japanese defensive positions. They laid coral gravel. They poured concrete. They built roads where there had been jungle paths, and they built runways. Not one, not two. 6 runways, each more than 2 miles long, carved into the flat coral interior of an island that weeks earlier had belonged to 9,000 Japanese soldiers. The Americans called it North Field, built on the site of a former Japanese airfield near the northern tip of Tinian, now expanded into the largest bomber base in the world at that moment in history. Built on ground that Harry Hill had fought to take the right way. In November of 1944, the first B-29 superfortresses took off from Tinian and flew north toward Japan. They kept flying, through the winter, through the spring of 1945. On the morning of August 6th, 1945, 2:45 in the morning, a B-29 named Enola Gay lifted off from North Field and turned north toward Japan. 6 hours later, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The war ended 9 days later. None of that runway existed without those 2 beaches. None of those missions happened without the men who took that island. And none of it, not the landing, not the runways, not any of what followed, happens if one American admiral accepts the answer he was given and stops asking questions. Turner received his 4th star. He was decorated. He was cited in official histories. His name was attached to the operations he commanded. Hill went on to Iwo Jima. He commanded the amphibious force that put more than 60,000 Marines on that island in February of 1945. Then Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War, where Hill coordinated the landing of nearly 200,000 American troops on a Japanese island, just 60 miles from the home islands themselves. He was present at every major amphibious operation in the Central Pacific, from Tarawa onward. Every beach where American boys climbed out of landing craft and ran toward whatever was waiting for them. Hill's staff had planned how those men would get there. He finished the war as one of the most accomplished amphibious commanders the United States Navy had ever produced. From 1950 to 1952, he served as superintendent of the United States Naval Academy, shaping the next generation of officers the way his generation had been shaped, by learning what it cost to make the right call when the wrong one was so much easier. He retired as a full admiral. In 1974, 30 years after the landing, the United States Navy commissioned a destroyer escort and named it USS Harry W. Hill. History has a way of deciding who gets remembered based on who made the most noise. Turner made noise. Hill made decisions. There is no statue on Tinian with his name on it. There is no memorial at the spot where those 2 beaches changed the course of the war. Until today, there was no video about him on YouTube. Every man who fought on Tinian came home carrying something the official record never captured. He knew which decisions made the difference. He knew which officers he would follow into the water without hesitation, and which ones he would not. He knew the name of the man in the landing craft beside him, climbing up that coral cliff on that morning. Some of those men came home and talked about it, once at the dinner table, maybe twice. A detail about the first night, a name that never made it into any book, what it looked like coming off that beach with the sun just starting to come up, and the whole island still ahead of them. If your father was there, on Tinian, on Saipan, on any one of those islands, or if your grandfather stood on the deck of one of those ships and watched the smoke rise from 3 miles away, he carried something that doesn't exist anywhere except in the people who heard him tell it. Don't let it disappear. Leave a comment below. One name, one detail, one thing he told you that you have never heard anywhere else. The official history of Tinian is 9 days and a set of casualty numbers. The real history is in the people who were there. And right now, the only place those stories still exist is in the people watching this.